Welcome to the not subcut podcast, but the subcut part of this.
That'll work.
We're on YouTube. This is a time I really want to just dive into each of your individual stories. I really probably should have done this in the original one. Can you just give a brief introduction to yourselves and a few sentences on kind of your background?
Right.
Age before beauty.
Well, I'm Art and Nic. I'm a general physician. I've trained in the U.S. Been practicing for about 20-something years. I've been in New Zealand since about 2005. I came with my Kiwi wife and a couple of little kids for a year. That was 15 years ago, and I'm very happy that I stayed, considering how things are going. And I do general medicine. I'm heavily involved in medical education, and along with Nick, we produce and host a podcast called IMreasoning.
You're not going to tell them where you're from? Boston?
I'm from Boston.
Well, that's important.
I get grief every time I say that. I thought I would skip over that.
The incentives are against it. So my name is Nick Sheckett. I am also from North America, but I'm from the Canadian part. Not originally from Canada. I was born in Argentina, and I lived in several different places in the world before I went to Canada. But I did all my training in Toronto, or close to Toronto, and ended up here 10 years ago for the second time. We actually came early on in late 2003, worked up in Whangarei for a couple of years, went back to Canada, but then decided that New Zealand was the place, and so came back about 10 years ago. I train in general internal medicine, so I'm a general internist as well, and I work at Auckland Hospital, been there for 10 years.
So the IMreasoning podcast is internal medicine reasoning, is what the IM sort of stands for. And so if you're watching this video, you're probably also listening to their podcast. But if not, go check that out. We'll leave links in the description. What was the thing that drew you into general medicine or internal medicine?
Well, I had a very circuitous route to get to internal medicine. In medical school, I was a pediatrics keener. I was going to be a pediatrician, loved the kids, and ended up doing quite a few electives in pediatrics. And then I did a whole year of research. I took a year out of medical school, went to do research in South America, and the research was all in quality of life testing in survivors of pediatric cancer. And by the end of the year, I was done with kids. I mean, it was so painful, some of these stories. I said, you know what? I love kids. That's what I like about pediatrics is I just like kids. I'll just have my own kids. And then I don't have to see all these sick kids. Because it was heart-wrenching. It really was. Yeah. And so I decided at that point, what else can I do? And it was just around this time that I did my obstetrics rotation.
Modeling was out.
No, it was still at that time. Anyway, so I did my obstetrics rotation. I thought, this is amazing. This is medicine and surgery and babies and everything. Everyone's happy. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. So I finished medical school, got my first choice, obstetrics and gynecology, University of Toronto, started there. Did about 6 months and then thought, what have I done?
No.
And actually, I didn't mind what I was doing. It was more the people that I was working with. I just did not enjoy it. It was just a group that was very cynical, and I just didn't enjoy interacting with them. And this was just around the time that I had my internal medicine run as part of my training. And I thought, this is for me. This is real doctoring. These guys run to the code blues and they save people and they diagnose all sorts of interesting things and they love education and learning and teaching and they're very cerebral. So that matched me a little bit better. So I decided to switch into internal medicine. And
sorry, just for anyone who might be like me that actually doesn't know what internal medicine or general medicine is, do you guys just want to give a brief about what you guys deal with?
Yeah.
Well, it's all of medicine for adults. So
That is not surgery.
that is not surgery, right? So we do a bit of cardiology, a bit of kidney medicine, a bit of respiratory medicine, a bit of dermatology. So we're sort of, generalists in the sense that we know a little bit about all the different disciplines within medicine. And usually we deal with two kinds of patients. One is usually the undifferentiated acute patient, as well as the sort of complex patient with lots and lots of systems involved in their illness. So, we take the place, we don't have the kidney doctors looking after the kidneys and the heart doctors looking after the heart and the respiratory doctors looking after the lungs. We can do all of that, and we can sort of coordinate care for people with lots of medical problems.
And often we're act as sort of the quarterback in many of these patients, because it's often you want to balance.
I like that. He just used an American football metaphor. Wow, that's impressive.
Do they play football in Boston?
It's very impressive. Very impressive.
So because often the kidney doctors are only interested in the kidneys, and and all the different specialties in their own organ, and we have to balance the interests, right? Not too dry, not too wet, not too hot, not too.
We're the
Goldilocks.
Goldilocks.
Right.
We're the Goldilocks.
But on our best days, I would say that the work is about diagnosis, is about interesting diagnosis. I mean, that's not every day, and it's not often, but that is part of our job, is that really interesting diagnostic conundrum.
So the person who comes in with a headache without a diagnosis, we have to sort through that and figure out, is this a serious kind of headache? Is it not a serious kind of headache? And that was one of the things that drew me to internal medicine to begin with, was just the detective work involved in trying to come up with diagnoses, trying to extract information from people who may not have an easy time of explaining their symptoms, and then trying to figure out, based on physical exam and tests and so forth, what it's likely to be. And just like Nick didn't gel with the obstetrics folks, the data suggests that what you do as a career is very often based upon the people that you encounter in that discipline. And I was very, very fortunate very early on to have a mentor who was just immediately somebody that I wanted to emulate. He was a Harvard-trained physician who was erudite and could talk about symphonies and literature as easily as he could talk about congestive heart failure. And I thought, I want to be that guy. And so, and general medicine, internal medicine is filled with people who have lots of interesting experiences and are interested in education. I was a high school teacher before I went to medical school.
Wow.
I forgot about that. That's right.
This is good.
Yeah, so I knew that I wanted to do something that continued on with education. And general physicians are, by and large, the ones in most large hospitals who manage most of the teaching.
And I would say that is a huge part of our job, if not most of our job, is actually teaching it, passing it down. I mean, yes, we're practicing and we're seeing patients as we do it, but really it's about look at what I've learned, and so that you can do that. That's what we do.
I can definitely say that the majority of my actual learning probably happened in general medicine, or if not the learning, the actual application of the knowledge that I was accumulating, that I got the chance to just apply. And I think the part, so you mentioned before undifferentiated acute patients. So people that don't know what that means, undifferentiated means you don't know what it is, and acute means that it's a little bit urgent, that it's just come in. So the idea that it could be really anything. And so there's a line in the sand, really, and the line in the sand seems to move depending on where you work. Where does the territory of general medicine end and a specialty sort of begin? And in some hospitals that have very enthusiastic, for example, cardiology departments, the line is a lot, their territory is a lot larger. So general medicine's territory is a little bit smaller. And So the fact that when you see someone in the emergency department, and this is the thing that I really liked about general medicine, was that, I'm not just saying that because you guys are here, is that, you can go into ED and there's just a person coming in for something that could just be 20, 30, 40 different things, and 10 of them are realistically viable possibilities. And that type of organic thinking process, honestly, you don't get that a lot in some other specialties, because by the time you're already seeing them, it's already narrowed down to a list, and there's a lot more of that pattern recognition, and the stuff that's not so much pattern recognition tends to be more rare. So that sort of, I guess, was it type 2 thinking isn't activated as...
Now, talk about mental exhaustion. I mean, there are some days that I wish everything was sorted out before I got there. This is your diagnosis, now deal with it.
Yeah.
Some days I would like that because I'm really tired, and there is fatigue that's associated with continuously being uncertain and having to decide where to go next. There is fatigue associated with that for me.
But there's excitement as well.
Yeah.
I mean, when you are looking at a patient, for example, who comes in with shortness of breath, it could be almost anything that causes that. By the time they make it to the cardiologist for their shortness of breath, they pretty much know that that's where the problem lies. Whereas for general physicians, it can be anything. And so the opportunity to really engage your brain and engage your cognition is huge.
Now, Art, before you said that the general medicine had a lot of the education, which is a big draw for you, the teaching. If general medicine didn't have so much of that, do you still feel that you would have ended up being drawn towards that for all the other aspects of it that you were mentioning?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I'm a generalist at heart. I think I like lots of things. I have an eclectic group of interests within medicine and outside of medicine, and I would have had a really difficult time, I think, had I had to narrow my choice down to being a renal physician or a respiratory physician. I really liked being and keeping my horizons broad.
And Nick, how much was the educational aspect pivotal for you?
It was big. It was big. I mean, you train in a large academic teaching center, and I never envisioned that I would do anything different. I mean, my role models were academic internists who were, 75% of their time was engaged in education, medical education, and I envisioned that I would do exactly the same thing. It was actually slightly less. I've been slightly less involved here with medical education than I was when I was working in Toronto. There's less of a focus on it.
And is that sort of the reason that you guys started the IMreasoning podcast, because of that educational drive? What was the story actually behind leading to the creation of that?
Yeah, so it was really accidental. I mean, in some senses, because Art, you and I were talking about doing this curriculum for we had gotten interested in clinical reasoning, you in particular.
Yeah, well, first of all, our offices were just across the hall. Right? And so we would sit there and we would talk about, does God exist? Is there free will? All these sort of big...
The answers, by the way, no and no. I'll just put it out there.
I thought it was...
We can have a talk afterwards.
I thought it was... I thought you guys had offices next to each other because of the
No,
podcast. Okay.
It was just pure coincidental geography. And I became very interested in clinical reasoning because of a really horrible error that I made, a diagnostic error.
I think I've heard this story.
We've talked... Nick always says it's my Catholic upbringing. I'm whipping myself continuously because I'm so full of
self-flagellation.
But I made a very sort of basic but significant diagnostic error. And it really made me think. And I kept wondering, does this mean that I'm a bad doctor? Or does it mean that my thinking was just wrong in this instance? And I wasn't quite sure. So part of my journey to sort of get over the trauma of that mistake was to really delve deep into clinical reasoning. And what I realized, fortunately, is that good doctors make mistakes probably as frequently as bad doctors. Maybe not quite as frequently, but it could be close. And so I became very interested in clinical reasoning. I took a sabbatical and I went to Australia and I went back to Harvard to sort of see what was being done in terms of teaching clinical reasoning.
Because you did your training at what part of your training was that at Harvard?
So I did my internship and residency or house officer year and registrar years in a Harvard training hospital. And so I came back. Nick was very interested in this, I think, to begin with, and we talked about the fact that it didn't seem to be emphasized in New Zealand. People in New Zealand, because I remember asking my trainees, well, what's your differential diagnosis? And it would be like a possum in the headlights.
You've got brief, traumatic flashback just right now from hearing those words.
Differential diagnosis.
I aim to improve.
So that's how we both became interested in clinical reasoning, but how it became a podcast.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about the clinical reasoning part, and there was an opportunity that came up to create there was sort of a gap that had been created, I think, in the fifth year of medical school, and so they said, well, who wants to contribute to this gap in the educational curriculum? And we thought, well, why don't we put something together for clinical reasoning? And we were thinking and talking about it a lot. And around this time, I ended up going to this conference in Australia. It was a critical care conference. And I just wandered into this session called Make Your Own Podcast. And I thought, I am never going to make my own podcast, ever. This is stupid, but whatever. I'll listen to this guy. He sounds interesting. And I came out literally 45. I'm such a, I'm a complete, I don't know what you call, a sponge. But I came out 45 minutes later thinking.
Techno geek.
Well, no, it wasn't. No, I was saying that I was just so persuadable because I came out 45 minutes later and I thought, I am totally making a podcast. This guy was great.
And then you totally did.
Yeah. So we came back and I said, why don't we record stuff and do it asynchronously? We don't have to travel all over the country to do this curriculum.
And after I looked up what a podcast was, I said, yeah, let's do it.
And then we just kept on going.
And so when was this? What year was the first year of the podcast?
4 years ago?
5, I think now.
5 years?
Yeah, I think so. 2015.
I have to really testify that you both really truly are very into the education aspect. I would have to say that you're the most teaching engaged out of all the consultants that I've ever worked with. Actually, you have both been very influential in. Okay, I don't know how positive the outcome is of being influential in my personal education, given that I ended up quitting medicine.
Drove you out.
But, no, because so when I was in my 4th year, my first run was general medicine, and that was with you, and I knew absolutely nothing. I knew less than nothing. Like I'd be more likely to get if I just took a random guess, I'd get the wrong differential. Like even a random chance would have done better. So my clinical knowledge was so poor, and that was the first time I had ever even thought about or even considered the idea of clinical reasoning. And actually the way that it was taught then is different to the way that, Neil, you guys are taught now, where you have more clinical stuff embedded starting from 2nd year, 3rd year. Up until that point, I'd been getting sort of A minus range, doing my tests and exams fine. I was like, I'm ready, let's do this. I can do it. I did my history in 3rd year. I was like, I can talk to patients. I've got my clinical examinations. And I see someone with, I remember this case so clearly. I saw someone with diabetes. And I just, it was just, I just couldn't think. There was nothing. It was just empty. It was like
nothing
echoing
to regurgitate
inside. Yeah, I couldn't even. I don't even know where to begin the process. And you held a teaching thing for all the 4th year students at that time, where you went through the idea of sort of looking at a symptom and assigning that with the process of coming to a differential diagnosis. By the way, if you're not familiar, differential diagnosis is what are the things that it could possibly be, potential things that we will rule in or out based on symptoms and signs. So going through that, I had a transcendental moment of thinking this is.
I don't want to be like that guy.
And then I resigned through tears. No, I just thought this is how doctors think. It makes sense now. I can understand now for the first time how what I learned in medical school could actually be used for me to solve real cases. The black box, which people sometimes talk about, where there's so much to know and you don't know. It's just unfathomable to know and see how someone could know that. And I think the public really shares that. Like, you can think, how can someone come in with a headache and then 2 days later you know exactly what it is? Like, how is that even possible? And that was like the first time I actually did that. Now, actually, during that run, I remember that you marked me really low for that run because
You did drive him out.
because of the fact that I didn't know anything. And no, I remember this was very vivid in my memory because it was actually, I think, a pivotal moment in my education, in my training.
And that's how he quit.
Because you actually said, like, when you mark your students, you think, do I want this person to be my house officer? What would I think of them to be someone that I'd be comfortable working with? And you said that my knowledge wasn't enough to know. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to let you pass, but I'm going to, I'm going to say that there are concerns. But it turns out that when you tick in a certain way, it just algorithmically fails you. So I ended up failing that run.
Really?
And so,
did you know you were gonna fail him?
No.
Oh god!
because there's no pass fail thing. It just says where there are concerns. And like, if I think about it now, I don't have the sheet. I don't have it like framed on my wall or anything. But I would agree that my
a
clinical
picture of me with like an axe in the middle of it.
Or a dartboard of his face.
the voodoo doll that I've. And after that run, I thought, okay, I really need to change the way that I think about clinical reasoning and the way that I think about education. Because what I was doing during that run is, I remember seeing some very rare cases that I have never seen since then. And I remember thinking, okay, I need to learn this. And I used to spend, the week studying all these cases without actually looking at my fundamentals. I wasn't able to rapidly differentiate through chest pain in a quick way, but I was able to look at some herniation of a brainstem, some rare sort of. I would spend a lot of my time studying that, and so that was the first time I kind of had that switch. So I, after failing that run, I then had to go and get 3 consecutive distinctions for the rest of the year in order for me not
You
to.
talked about this on that
my
was you?
God.
This is the origin of it. So if you guys have seen
Should we
the
switch seats
episode,
here? It's getting a little hot.
so there's this story I had with psychiatry. I've got it's like 2 episodes almost on the podcast of me and my experience going through psychiatry. Anyway, long story short, you know what? I'm not even gonna. It's worth it. Go look it up.
Yeah.
Watch that. It's the people have commented about it
Cliffhangers.
a lot. Yeah. So. I had to end up getting 3 consecutive distinctions for the rest of the year in order to not have to repeat the year. I ended up not having to repeat, but then I had to, I was tagged in my 5th year, and then I had to make sure that I got another 3 distinctions that year to make sure that I wouldn't sit another OSCE examination at the end of that year. And I managed to do that. So it was kind of the trigger for me to actually start taking my education a little bit more from the doctor's side, working towards that rather than from the student side, kind of progressing forward.
I mean, what you've highlighted there is a transition that all the students do have to make at some point.
Yeah.
That what you learn in medical school is just packed information, lots of questions, ask everything, make sense of it later. And what you do in practice at the other end, years and years down the line, is think in an organized way about what's in front of you. And my knowledge base, I can tell you, has never been anywhere close to my colleagues. But you can look stuff up. Like, that's not the Achilles heel. There's places where you can look up information. You want to have an organized approach to the patient. And that's the transition that all the students have to make at some point.
Very
I
true.
just forced you to make it a bit earlier, Justin.
Yeah, well, I think it was
Violently.
I mean, it was. I'll admit there was some stress related to that for that year.
Anger.
Not for me.
Some violence.
Not until now.
Well, actually, and then it kind of went in a not quite a full circle, but then I was, Nick, I was your student as a final year medical student. Now, I did my honors in between that, and so that could be an entire year to forget everything I'd learned, and that was great, obviously. So I had to restudy my entire, I was at the beginning of my final year of medical school, throughout doing my honors and after 5th year. I was Googling how to take a history. If you go back on my Google search long enough, at the beginning of my final year of medical school, I was Googling how to take history. I was doing a study on dry eyes, and there's a study that says that severe dry eyes has a quality of life impact comparable to that of angina.
Wow.
And so I was saying that to my participant, and they were like, "Oh yeah, what's angina?" And I was like, "Well," and I just forgot, and I forgot what angina now. Okay, you guys will probably, if you're not medical, angina is it's something that everyone should know. In every, I would hope every second, third year medical student would know what angina is. I mean, a final year medical student not knowing angina is inconceivable knowledge deficit. So that was a stressful holiday. So I then entered into general medicine under Nic, and in my mind, it was almost like a kind of like a spiritual way to kind of prove myself. After
I think you did from memory.
I hope it. You gave me a distinction for that run. But I
I laid the groundwork. You get the laurels.
Yeah, so I thought it was Actually, I think I actually swapped with another student just so that I could be on the team that had you as the consultant, so that I would have the kind of opportunity to close that loop. Because it was like that, it was like a punctuation mark. It was an open, there's like a semicolon without a full stop.
There's no distinction between us, by the way. You and I are the same thing. If you can close the loop.
I spiritually had overlapped the two of you.
Oh no.
But yeah, so I mean, that was and then I've been listening to your podcast in between that time as well, and a lot of the stuff that you end up talking about in your podcast was of the similar vein of stuff that you were teaching when I was a fourth year, and it was yeah.
But Justin, with respect to the experience that you had, closing that whole loop, there are experiences that we have in our life that we would never want to repeat, but we are very thankful that we had them.
Yeah.
And, it sounds like possibly one of those, because it was stressful and it didn't feel good at the time, but it really gave you a kick up the butt.
Yeah,
I've had those experiences as well. I specifically remember my rheumatology run when I was training. Oh my God, I bombed that so bad, and it really gave me a kick up the butt to read up on my rheumatology.
Right.
Never go back to that.
I
hospital.
think I was listening to a recent episode of one of you guys, and I think your Achilles heel is rheumatology. Was it neurology?
Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, right. But funny you mentioned that, because that's actually what my next question was going to be, and we've talked a bit about the impact that some of our clinical experience and stuff, or at least Justin's clinical experience, that the impact that you guys have had. And you said that you've had particular memorable experiences that definitely shape you moving on into your future as well. But holistically, coming from the standpoint of students in general, what were each of your student pathways or your education pathways like, and maybe one or two tips that you would recommend for us looking forward?
I don't know how, you probably know a lot about medical school in New Zealand as well, but is it quite different to overseas in America and Canada?
Well,
It's
yes,
longer.
It is. Well,
Is it?
no, it's shorter.
No. Oh,
but
really?
But it's more concentrated, I think.
Okay.
So you do 4 years of undergraduate.
This is in North America.
In North America.
Yeah.
So this is in the U.S. You do 4 years of an undergraduate degree, so a BA or a BSc, and it can be in anything. My major was in psychology. And then you apply to medical school, and you have 4 years of medical school, so 2 preclinical, 2 clinical. And then you do 1 year of house officer year, or what we call internship, and then 2 years of residency or registrar years. But it's all in medicine. So if you decide that you want to do medicine, all of your experiences are in medicine.
Although your first year of internship would have been a bit of rotating, emergency medicine and maybe some
Sure, but it was, I didn't do any, I didn't do any general surgery,
no.
psychiatry, neurosurgery, ophthalmology, orthopedics. I didn't do any of that
Right.
as a trainee. So it is a different structure. You know, after I did my undergraduate degree and got a degree in psychology, I had taken lots of science because I always was interested in science, and I became a science teacher. And I didn't really have much intention of going to medical school, but it was always something I thought might be somewhat interesting. And then I was sort of 3 or 4 years into being a teacher and realized that I was really struggling to pay off my undergraduate loans on the salary of a high school teacher. And so I thought, well, I'll give it a go. What have I got to lose?
So you are in it for the money.
I was in it so that I didn't have to. I remember I was my final year of teaching. Now, this granted was back in the sort of around 1990, I think, something like that. I was making $16,000 a year.
This is way back.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I was really struggling to pay off my university undergraduate loans. So, but if I was in it for the money, I would have become an ophthalmologist or a dermatologist or something, because using this doesn't get paid nearly as well as using these.
But on that note of in it for the money, it's all relative. The good news is that I haven't had to give much thought to money or money stress. I did growing up in my household. I was always worried about that because of what my parents were up to and their financial security. And this, for me, this was a huge change where all of a sudden salary, right off the bat, I don't have to worry about anything. And then a decent salary. I really don't have to think about it. So in it for the money, yes, in the sense that I don't want to have to worry about money, but not in it for the money.
No, yeah.
You know what I mean?
I was just trying to more friction than we already had.
But I, every millisecond of being a medical student was like somebody shoving needles under my fingernails. I hated every bit of it. I had been out living on my own, professional, and then I felt like I went from being an adult to being a child, and being spoon-fed information that I knew was going to be completely useless to whatever I wanted to do, and being treated like an infant, and I resented it horribly. It was a real struggle to get through medical school for me.
See, I didn't have, because I was a child when I was in medical school.
How old were you when you were in medical school?
Well, so I went to university at 18, and then 4 years of university, so that's 22, and then I worked for, I think it was 4 years as
right.
So in my mid to later 20s, I guess.
My entire class was like you, except for me. Everyone else was like you. I went to a school called McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. It's about an hour from Toronto. And it's like Hamilton here in many ways. I've never gone back since I graduated.
Interpret that how you will. I guess interpret that given that you're not going to go back.
How you will.
But McMaster was a somewhat famous medical school from the point of view of medical education. It was the first school to invent problem-based learning, and a lot of other schools have adopted it since then.
Still very well known.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the joke about McMaster was that in order to actually get into McMaster, you had to be a minority, you had to be female, you had to be gay, you had to be, 30, you had to have 3 careers before. Like, they would only take the most, alternative pathways into that school. So me being 22, coming into McMaster and having done an undergraduate in science was very strange. My classmates were saxophone players and psychologists and social workers and nurses, and so everyone was about your age when they came in, or a little bit older, and had previous careers.
Maybe you slipped in because you speak like 5 languages. That was your.
I think honestly, I think that's what it was. I think I slipped in because I had an interesting backstory. I had lived in different places in the world, and I did speak different languages. But yeah, it was a difficult school to get into with a traditional background.
By the way, I remember the ward round where we had you got to speak all of your languages.
Were you at
back
that
then.
ward round?
I was there, and you
that
even
was my best ward round ever.
commented
Oh, I'm so happy.
we had the
Tell us.
we had the patient. I think he spoke perfect English, but you just chose to do it in Hebrew.
What? Wait, what language
You were like,
do you
you're gonna do it anyway.
Well, no one else knew how bad my Hebrew was, so I was going to sound amazing anyway. No, but the first patient was a patient from El Salvador who truly didn't speak anything but Spanish, and I'm like, guys, I got this. And then the second patient.
See, I knew that much, but I didn't expect it to just.
Well, the next patient was a patient from Tahiti, and they only spoke French, and I was like, guys, I got this. And by this time, the team is like, what's going on here? And then
I was the team. I was like, what's going on?
The third patient was this Israeli tourist who obviously speaks English. I'm like, nah, I'm doing this in Hebrew.
Right, he was a tourist.
Oh my god!
It's been downhill from there. From that day.
What was your reaction? Were you guys just like,
Me, I remember.
is this a joke?
Well, I was the final year student then.
You set this up?
Me and the house officer and registrar were just like, what the hell? we were both like kind
The
of.
stars aligned. It
I
was
mean,
just amazing.
I mean, it's impressive, right? Like, but at the same time, it's also like, what's the job? Like, what are we doing? Like, what happened? What happened right now? Like, what's the patient's situation?
That's good.
Yeah.
I didn't remember that you were there.
No, I was there. I was
Most
there.
glorious moment.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, did you guys have any other questions you want?
Yeah, actually, talk to us a bit about your background then. Like, what was the reason, if you're happy to talk about it, that you were moving around?
So I was born in Argentina. My parents were in Argentina. And it was a time when they would have had good reasons to leave Argentina. There was political stuff going on at the time. So it was around 1975. And we moved to Belfast, Northern Ireland, because, well, my parents thought this was like glamorous Europe, that they were, and then of course they hit Belfast in 1975, not glamorous and not really Europe. It was a pretty troubled place at the time. We were there for 4 years because my parents were doing their graduate degrees at Queen's University there. And so I learned English in Belfast. So my first accent was a Northern Irish accent. I've lost, obviously, since then.
Show us.
Wow. Impersonation.
So we then moved from there to Israel, which is where my parents had always, we're a Jewish family. My parents had always wanted to move to Israel. And after about 2 years and a lot of culture shock and the realization that we were going to have to participate in this military situation that my parents were not fully signed on to, they said, no, we made a mistake. And so they moved away from Israel.
So how old were you around that?
I was around 10.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you've already lived in 3 different places.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And then we went to North America, and we, started in Canada, ended up in the States for a couple of years in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then back to Canada, where I said, okay, enough's enough. I'm staying here no matter what you guys do. So
you left.
Yeah, and then but I brought my parents with. So yeah, so when we moved to New Zealand, my parents came with us.
Payback.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. I think, I don't know if it's just a phase that I'm in currently recently, but I think a lot about where the future's going to take my peers and myself as well. And I think just before they were talking about uncertainty, and I think living with that, I think more from a medical context with what you guys are referring to. But I like to imagine myself 10 or 20 years from now looking back retrospectively and then rethinking, were my expectations fulfilled, or is life now, 20 years from now, what I expected it to be 20 years ago now? Could you guys say, or could you guys comment, have your expectations been met, or did you think that you had any of those hypotheses, or how much control did you have in your life that way? They're very big questions, I'm sorry, but they're very interesting people, so...
I guess I'll think about it this way. If you had asked me when I was a teenager, would I be the person I am now, doing what I'm doing, living where I am, I wouldn't have even been able to point to New Zealand on a map.
It's usually not on the map, but
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very
US
working
education.
class, blue collar, crime ridden area
In the Boston area.
in the Boston area, north of Boston. Yep,
I
north
almost
of
forgot
Boston.
about that.
Boston, by the way, has more major sports championships than any other city in the world, but that's okay. I won't
Yeah,
go
can we
there.
have a little like yeah. Thanks for that.
You know, and my father had to beat me to go to high school and beat me to go to college. I didn't want any part of, none of my friends were going to university. And then when I went to university, everything changed. And, you know, things just kind of went from there. And I would never have, I mean, I would have predicted I would have been in jail maybe. Or
Wow. That's
yeah, I mean, I remember I took my son back to where I grew up, and the primary school where I went to doesn't have a blade of grass. It's just concrete. And he looked at me and he said, "Man, this is bleak." So yeah, I had no aspirations really to speak of.
Wow.
So I would never have predicted I would be where I am now.
wow.
When did you start? Actually, first question is: did you ever start thinking about where you could be once you had that realization? Once you went to was it high school or uni?
Well, so I was always a good student.
Okay.
Because my brother and many of my family members were pretty outstanding athletes. And I couldn't be that good an athlete. So I thought, okay, well, I'll do something else.
Sure.
So I was always a good student, but I wasn't very motivated, and I didn't really have, as I say, any aspirations to do very much. Most of my friends just sort of, we hung out and got into trouble occasionally. And my father just said, you know what? You're not doing this. So I went to a local private school, which I hated because I wasn't where my friends went. But I gradually got to really like it because I got challenged, and I was introduced to poetry, which I have written since high
So
school.
that's when it started.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it was such that I was writing poetry in high school, and I was sticking it in my desk drawer because, I would have rather my parents find a Playboy magazine than a poem. So I was sticking it under the Sports Illustrated magazine.
Hide it in your Playboy.
Yeah, hiding it under. And then when I went to university, I just my eyes were opened, and I just thought, wow, I can do lots of stuff because here are people who are doing lots of stuff, and the idea of being a doctor really was kind of an afterthought.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, try follow that.
Well, I actually
I'm
didn't.
very
I
interested.
wasn't on. I never got on a plane
Wow.
until I was probably in my 20s. So my father worked 365 days a year, and we never had.
Well, some of our travels early on were by ship,
Yeah.
so it's not
Yeah.
like it necessarily, had to be by plane. But yeah, no, my experience was very different. I have an audio tape that my parents preserved from when I was 2 or 3 years old, and audio tape. Do you know what I'm talking
You mean
about?
the one with you put the pencil in to rewind?
Yeah, that one. That one.
Like a cassette.
Yeah, cassette tape.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and they had a recording, and it was my grandmother, my mom's mom, asking me, "So what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a doctor, so that when you die, I will cure you."
Damn.
I've learned some facts from
Make me
since
cry,
then.
Nick. You're gonna make
The
me
chances
cry.
are very low in
Yeah,
those
the
situations.
timing of that isn't quite right. But,
But I wanted to be a doctor from, as far back as I can remember. And I had a bit of a crisis in my undergrad. I went to University of Toronto, and it was 60,000 students at this massive school in the city, and I felt like this small, tiny. And I had at one point I had a sort of a reflection. It's like, do I really want to be a doctor? I mean, I haven't even thought about it before. I really had never thought about what I wanted to do. It's just a given.
Yeah.
But what was not, what was definitely a given was that I was going to, that it was going to be something higher education, because there was no question of that in my family. That was never in question. My dad was a PhD in engineering with multiple postdocs. My mom had 3 degrees. I mean, it was that was always going to be the case. And and doctor is good. In that family, in that culture.
Very articulate. Doctor is good.
That's how it works.
Hi, doctor.
Quote that.
Me, doctor.
Good.
All right.
I was gonna wrap it up, but I have to ask you something now, because you sort of mentioned that you never really thought about it. This is one of the topics that we talk about a lot, not just me with the work that I do now, but also on the podcast. We talk about the fact that when you go into really any profession, but especially something like medicine, which is super opaque and heavily romanticized, students, when they're 16, 17, however old they were when they were saying, I'm going to be a doctor, they don't actually know what they're getting into. It's realistically, and I'm only realizing this over the last few years of trying to teach people about it, it's realistically not possible for someone to actually get enough career insight to truly make an informed decision about it, really. And so the question that I really think about now is, how important is it for someone to know that much about their career before they decide to, jump onto that?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I do know how to answer that. I don't think it's important. I don't think it's important. I think the whole thing is a journey, and you just can't expect to have the wisdom at 16 or 17 when you have to make that decision. Yeah. And so, like with anything else, I think you end up just jumping in and deciding. I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that nothing is forever, right? I mean, you can change your mind. It takes courage. There's no question. It takes courage. And I often wondered whether, there were moments when I could or should have decided something different and I didn't have the courage to. I can think now in retrospect that there's all sorts of things that I would have liked doing in life. I don't know. It's easy to say once I've been the doctor and once I've had the job and the work, maybe it's a bit gratuitous to say I could have done so many other things. But I think that is true. And I think if you have the courage to change your mind and say, actually, I'm going to start a different track, that's always possible.
I've kind of drifted more towards that style of thinking as well. I used to be very about, when I was maybe sort of 4 or 5 years ago, when I was just, people were asking me, about medicine, and I was in my sort of 5th year of medical school and doing that. So I would kind of say, know what you're getting into, all of that sort of stuff. I was really big on having the informed decision. And Neil, I mean, you were kind of in that generation I was, when I was teaching, it was that kind of mentality. Now I just do the basics of like, look, this is what it's about. Look, here's a balanced view on it. But I try to now push the look, if you want to change your mind, you can do that. It's not a bad thing if you want to reselect, if you want to deviate, if you want to sidetrack, if you want to pause, if you just giving people the awareness that there is a freedom to be able to actually do that.
I had classmates who had finished medical school and then went into a venture capital firm or some consulting firm. And those are the moments when I said, I actually don't have I didn't know if I had the ability to do anything like that. I certainly didn't have the interest to do those things specifically, but I definitely did not have the courage to not follow that train of training, residency, get your license, practice medicine. I didn't have the courage to do a different track, but the whole thing is a journey. I think if you start in and you decide that it's not for you, but you can't know that at 17.
Yeah.
But the other thing too is that, a medical degree is generally not going to go amiss if if you can manage your way through it, you can travel with the skills that you have. You can go into venture capitalism, and people would hire you for many, many different things. So a medical degree doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a hospital-based doctor or whatever. You can branch out, and you can, in a lot of ways, travel with the skills that you have as well. So it's quite flexible.
And let's not minimize if you do go further and you become a hospital doctor, is an extremely marketable skill in the sense that if all you do is good medicine, you can work anywhere, anytime. And so in terms of security...
And as much as you like.
Yeah, that's right. There's always the demand for it. So in terms of security, certainly financial security, job security, and the ability to travel, as you say.
Yeah, surprising flexibility in how to work, where to work, what type of work, amount of work. And I think a lot of students going into it don't realize that there is so many roads available outside of that. Medicine is often sort of just that single tunnel, one road, railroad. It's hard to get on, hard to get off. But actually there's lots of different kind of paths out there.
Yeah, we were talking a bit about how it's a journey and stuff, and we've often talked about this as well, Justin, on the podcast, and Emma, about the difference between the goal-oriented mindset versus the process-oriented and stuff. That's one side of things, but I've also mentioned, I think I called it like a career choice paradox thing, where to make or to feel informed in making a particular career decision, you need some sort of experience or knowledge in the field itself, which can only come by being in the field already. And so it's this paradox over there. And then it turns into a question of uncertainty. So question is, I'm not sure if we've got enough time to answer this as well, but how do you stare in the faces of uncertainty? I guess advice to 20-ish year old kids, really. And
I think valid, because that's one of the most common questions people will ask me. They're either anywhere from year 13 through to final year of medical school. People will message me almost on a weekly basis asking, hey, I'm real jaded, or I don't know if I want to keep doing this. What is it? And I think people ask me because I did quit, and they want to get that perspective. And it is hard to actually answer that in a succinct kind of way, because it's so individual. But I know that is a question. That uncertainty is something that I know a lot of people out there, especially in the medical community, especially the younger generations,
right, will
want to get your perspectives on that. You've kind of gone through to the end of that. Yeah,
and defining that a bit further, I'm reading a book right now, A Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth by Chris Hadfield, commander of the International Space Station. Canadian, that's right, that's true. He built the Canadian arm for the ISS as well. And in it, he talks about his general approach to uncertainty. I guess being an astronaut, there's a lot of uncertainty going on over there. His general approach is just that he checks what can go wrong and assesses the risk of each of those, and then deals with those risks, tries to mitigate those and minimize those as far as possible. But with uncertainty, especially with career decisions or where we want to take our life in the future, I don't even know the risks involved, because I don't know the direction that I might want to go. I think I'm sort of going around in circles, and I can tell that I'm confused in asking the question itself. But maybe I'm just venting. I'll stop talking right now and leave to you guys.
Well, uncertainty is something we have spent a lot of time discussing, and we recently did a keynote speech for the University of Melbourne Medical Student Conference on uncertainty. And I don't know how it's happened, but there's a model of the world that seems to have developed, and part of it is our own cognitive development. We as human beings crave certainty. But the reality is that the world is all uncertainty. We talk about uncertainty as though the world were this sort of solid surface we could walk on, and we have to look out for the sinkholes of uncertainty. It's really like we're on this we're in this sort of quicksand of uncertainty. It's everywhere. And if we accept that it's everywhere and learn ways, and there are practical ways to learn to grow comfortable with uncertainty, then it's not a threat. It's a possibility, right? I mean, I'm not sure that I've ever been certain of any decision I've ever made in my entire life. In retrospect, I may
I was
be.
going to say in retrospect.
In retrospect, I may be. But at the time I'm making it, all I'm doing is sizing up the probabilities. I'm saying there's this action I can take, which may lead to this outcome. There's this action which may lead to that outcome, and I'm judging them, and I'm making, based upon my own values, based upon my desires, I'm making the best possible choice at that time. But I am fully aware when I'm making the decision that it could be the wrong decision. And that's okay, because sometimes the wrong decision leads you down the path where you should have been going in the first place. So we get all wound up about uncertainty, but in fact, we're swimming in it. And so just backstroke through it, just sort of lie back and enjoy the feeling, because it's everywhere.
But I think there's a bit of a tension as well between maybe what I would call passion or gut intuition about what you want, what you would like, and a more cerebral, analytical pros and cons kind of approach to if you're choosing career, for example.
Sure.
And I wouldn't recommend one. I would definitely recommend both.
Right.
You know, if you feel in your gut that you want to continue with this career, that's worth a lot. And then maybe decide what is it that you want to be doing day to day, right? And that might be a pros and cons type analysis.
But if you've gone with your gut and it doesn't turn out to be what you thought it was going to be,
have the
change-
courage. Have the
change
courage
tact.
to change it. Absolutely.
change tack.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
But your parents won't be proud. Just putting it out there.
No, I'm thankful I've got supportive parents. For that as well. But I'm sure for a large number of people as well, that could be another issue.
It's hugely stereotyped,
Yeah,
but it
yeah.
is a
And in addition to maybe parental, I guess, judgment or maybe peer judgment, there's also, I think this is the issue that I have with uncertainty. I think a lot of people have with it. It's just the idea that you would have wasted so much time, or this whole experience would have just been a waste, and you wouldn't have learned anything from it. But I can always say retrospectively that it was never a waste, and that I learned something from it, provided that I had that lens. I'm having that train of thought. It's just that I don't know what I'm going to learn since I haven't actually experienced it, and that's the fear that underpins the uncertainty for me, at least.
Yeah, I think, again, if you look at probabilities, the probability that you would have wasted your time if you started down doing a medical degree is very low, right? If you decided, as some of my high school, or kids that I grew up with, that they wanted to go down a tract of insurance fraud, probability
that you've made the wrong
probability
decision.
that you've made the wrong decision is quite high,
high.
right? But if you're deciding, if your choice is between thinking about the choice that I had, and this is how I remember thinking about this, right? I remember thinking my choice is between being a teacher, which I loved, or being a doctor, which I might love. It's not going to be a bad decision if I try that out, and if it doesn't work, there's always something else I can do. If the choice was between medicine and insurance fraud, I would have pushed on in medicine no matter what.
Oh, you might have loved insurance for it, though. That could have been your calling.
I could have been good at it.
You don't think that's a decision you'd be certain of? You said you had no certainty about any decision. That's a good one, though.
Well, you were also saying you're expecting you might find yourself in jail, but let's not find that to be true.
Well,
No.
yeah, a lot of my friends, unfortunately, kids that I grew up with, I just grew up in an area where it was quite easy to do. But yeah, I think we just have to accept uncertainty and learn to not embrace it. I mean, and look, there are biological inherent differences among all of us in terms of our innate ability to manage uncertainty. There's no question about it. And part of the reason why I'm a general physician probably is because uncertainty doesn't really bother me all that much. So if somebody comes in and they've got a diagnosis that isn't yet certain, I'm okay with that. I'll sit with it and I'll do what I can with it. So there are individual differences, but overall, we have to learn to accept it on some level because it's just so ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
Yeah. That's I think it was Albert Camus, I think, said along those lines, that
Albert.
Camus.
Canadian.
I was extremely culture corrected.
Sit down, please.
Yeah. I'm not even going to finish the point anymore.
Sorry. Sorry. That was.
I just Googled that. It's an interesting read. He talks about sort of absurdism and uncertainty and how we look for certainty and, these ideas of the only ways of escape. And he said the ultimate philosophical question was whether you kill yourself or not. And you can commit physical suicide or philosophical suicide to remove that uncertainty. And he says something along the lines of the greatest heroes are the ones who strive forward in the face of uncertainty, knowing for full well what it is, and that at a cosmic scale, it's all meaningless to a degree. And
he happens to be my favorite author, Justin. So
really,
so
wow.
absolutely.
And
So well done.
I was just say,
Well
researched
done
that
after a couple of
his
years.
essay on the man,
the myth of Sisyphus.
I've had that printed out, and I got the shirt that I always wear, the Wanderer Above
Is
Sea
that
of
it?
Fog. He wrote an essay about that because it has some kind of tie-in with.
He wrote The Plague, which is quite topical reading at the moment.
Okay.
Outside.
And The Outsider, or in America, it's called The Stranger.
Étranger.
Yeah.
Wow.
Fabulous philosophical
Oh,
writer.
add that to my reading list. That's great.
All right. Well, I mean, we just touched on a topic that I want to just dive into for another few hours, but we're not going to do that
I wish.
due to a lot of reasons. But thank you.
Not the
both
least
of
of
you.
which is your inability to pronounce French names.
Next 3 weeks, I'm not going to say any. I'll avoid any famous figure just in case of bastardizing the name. Thank you both for coming in. It's been awesome. Really love the conversations. I think you guys will definitely agree this was great. Maybe when we hit 10K followers, we'll invite you back on there. So remember, if you don't know the drill by now, dissect down on the like button, resuscitate down on the subscribe. Remember an odd number of times, 1, 3, 5, 7, not even numbers. And we will see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.